We can't live in fear. And I can't stand idly by and watch us stumble into the madness of possible nuclear destruction. And so I've come to a decision. I'm going to do what our governments have been unwilling or unable to do. Effective immediately, I'm going to rid our planet of all nuclear weapons.
Allow me to make an unpopular proposition. You can even call it somewhat of a cynical view of things, even though I don't necessarily think the view is wrong. This goes in line with Superman. Now, everybody knows who Superman is, the ultimate Boy Scout, freedom, justice, giving godlike abilities raised by Martha and Jonathan. What if I tell you, however, that by the time you get to Superman 4, the Superman that everyone likes, Christopher Reeve Superman, has become dictator of Earth? Oh, boo, hiss, how dare you, sir? You may not necessarily like me saying it, but I think it's borne out by the evidence. All notion of human agency in regards to directing the affairs of Earth, by the time you get to Superman 4 in continuity, Christopher Reeve Superman, are out the window. Sovereignty, out the window. Superman, dictator of Earth. Told you it was going to be an unpopular proposition. Doesn't mean I'm wrong. Welcome to the Black Box. So why do I make the point that Superman, by the time you get to Superman 4, is essentially a dictator of Earth? I think it's borne out by the evidence. Now, Superman 4 dealt with this notion that Superman has taken it upon himself, goes to the United Nations, and makes the extraordinary statement. He tells the world that he is going to take the weapons of Earth, that he is a moral obligation of sorts. And he has stood beside and watched. And no longer will he stand aside and watch. He is going to take the weapons, nuclear weapons, and he's going to throw those weapons into the sun. And the nations of the earth applauded this. And the next clip that you see is Superman taking the weapons that are being fired by the various nations of the world and throwing them into the sun. Now, 90% of the nuclear weapons on Earth are held by Russia and the United States, at the time the Soviet Union and the United States. We're to believe that Russia and the United States, that holds 90% of the nuclear weapons, looked at this and said, yes, this is a great idea. Do you honestly believe that somebody like John Bolton is going to listen to Superman, an alien, and allow that alien to direct the United States to get rid of his nuclear arsenal? Do you think that will be true of the Soviet Union? What about China? What about North Korea? Do you honestly believe that these governments are going to give up their weapons for an alien? So it gets across that this is out of line with the way people act. That this is a certain degree of propaganda, and not even good propaganda, because it's ludicrous that governments would act this way. I'm trying to make a point. If we can look at this as propaganda, the secondary question that we ask is, how do nations actually act? Despite Superman 4 focusing on Sun Man, the real story here was the international incident that was provoked by Superman after he gave that UN speech. Because what I would guarantee you is that there is no nation on Earth that would look at this, particularly any nation with nuclear power, and applaud. From the standpoint of the audience may think this is a good idea. But get into the head for the moment of war planners. Get into the head of the moment of nations. And a secondary question, are nuclear weapons the red line? Why are nuclear weapons the red line? When Bush decided to go into Iraq and upwards of 1 million people died in that on the pretext of weapons of mass destruction, did Superman have a say? Did Superman get involved? Did Superman have a perspective of those things? And yes, he's willing to get involved in nuclear weapons, but what about 100,000 dead? What about 1 million dead? The war in Yemen, the United States and Saudi Arabia, decimating populations, creating a humanitarian crisis by which we haven't seen in modern times. Does Superman get involved in that? What about what's taking place in Syria with the United States funneling weapons in the hands of terrorists in order to take down that nation? What about Libya? The complete destruction of that nation to the point where they're selling slaves. Does Superman get involved? Why is it just nuclear weapons? If life and the sanctity of life matters that much to Superman, what number of human beings dead, what amount of travesty and humanitarian crisis does it take for Superman to get involved and for Superman to move? This brings up two dilemmas that Superman have that are somewhat competing interests. One is morality, and the other one is legal. From a legal standpoint, are nation states sovereign? Meaning, are the affairs of a particular nation the business of the people of that nation? Now understand what we're saying here. A government gets power and authority and legitimacy by the people who put those people in office. Meaning, in a democratic system, the legitimacy of a government is conveyed by the people who go and vote and are activists and are trying to push for legislation and policy. You may not always like those people in power, but they're still considered legitimate. They have the sovereign, philosophical responsibility to look out the interests of the human beings in that particular society. And not just that, higher than any other one is the protection of that nation. All nations are like this. Based on international law, nation states are sovereign entities unto themselves. If that nation state decides it wants to invest resources and money into getting weapons, is it right for the alien to take those weapons? From a legal standpoint, that answer is unequivocally no. They're sovereign nations. They're sovereign states. If they want to invest their money in the weapons, they can invest their money in the weapons. Is it right for the alien to intervene into this? And what does it mean for any notion of sovereignty when that alien does? On a secondary issue with this, a moral one. As I mentioned earlier, why is nuclear weapons the red line? What about climate change? Scientists are coming out saying we have 12 years left. Nuclear weapons are horrible, but they're calling for a catastrophe that is talking about ending human existence. Does Superman get involved into that process? I mean, that is just as significant from the standpoint of a world-ending process. And Superman, I would imagine, has an extraordinarily long lifespan, meaning he will be around during the time that climate and our habitable space collapses. Does Superman get involved? He may have a moral obligation to do this, but that moral obligation conflicts dramatically with the legalities of things. The catch here, though, and the way that Superman has resolved this, is that the moral basis matters more. He's decided to take the step of throwing weapons into the sun, meaning he's ignored all notion of country sovereignty in order to pull this off. Between the two competing objectives, he has taken the step of saying the morality matters more. Human beings are real things. Those laws are not. And you may make the case that says, well, Superman morality is not real either, but it's real to Superman. There's a difference in human beings crafting laws that human beings need to apply to. But Superman, his morality is one thing. That's personal to him. That's specific to him. Those laws are not. And if those laws allow for human life and suffering to take an L, Superman decides he wants to get involved. Again, my question is, where is his level? Where's his level? Where does he intervene? I want to get into a secondary point. Sunman. It just so happens during the time where Superman creates this international incident, this international crisis where all notions of sovereignty are pretty much gone up in flames when Superman gives this extraordinary speech to the United Nations. All of a sudden there's a being that also is powered by the sun that Superman just so happens has to save the world from. How do we know that a Sunman exists? How do we know that Sunman wasn't a false flag that was there purely to get the world on board for the need for Superman? This way of playing politics by showing the world of how necessary Superman's protection is, and by showing them how necessary Superman protection is, gets them to not complain as much about the fact that he's just usurped sovereignty of all of these nations. I mean, because after all, Superman says no. Superman says no. What are you going to do? Are you going to fight Superman on this? Superman at this point has the last say-so over any and everything that takes place on the planet Earth. And he has just shown that he is perfectly willing to assert that fact. He's willing to assert that power of sorts. How do we know Sunman was real? How do we know Sunman wasn't a false flag? How do we know Sunman wasn't there purely to get people on board for this international crisis because they need Superman so much that they're less likely to complain? This does come across as a bit of propaganda in and of itself, even if you take out the Sunman component. Once you add in this point that nations don't act like this, all of this have to be taken with a certain degree of salt. If you accept for the moment that the nations did give up their weapons, the other part becomes why, and what were the grounds in which they gave up those weapons? And is it possible that they're yada-yadaing over a lot of crisis that took place in between those times? How do we know that Sunman was actually a thing? Last point. Superman is an asset of the United States. He carries the U.S. flag. He even screams about the values of the United States. If all of these countries give up their weapons, do these countries view Superman as an asset of the United States or an independent actor? I would guarantee you that countries like China, Russia, countries that are somewhat adversarial to our interests, or that we're adversarial to their interests, will not see Superman as an independent actor. They would take this with great suspicion. The United States wants us to give up our nuclear weapons, in which case they're going to keep the ultimate weapon, Superman himself. Is Superman an agent of U.S. foreign policy? Meaning, when Bush goes into Iraq with weapons of mass destruction in Iraq and Superman stands by and allows it to take place, if Iraq defends itself, does Superman get involved? Is Superman a tool of U.S. foreign policy? Looking at this show through a little bit more cynical lens, this doesn't look as good as they make this look. And there's a certain degree of propaganda that's put out by Superman, particularly from Superman 4. But the moment that you look into it and you start asking questions about it, meaning, how do actual states act? What would actual states do? And would these states be so willing to just give up their weapons willy-nilly in this way to an alien? Are those countries going to be okay with that? And whether the countries are okay with it or not, my basic argument here is that sovereignty is no longer a part of world affairs. And I think that argument is sound and right. Superman got his hands on the weapons of these various nations. Do you honestly believe that these nations would give that up willingly? And if not, then you have to at the very least agree with me that any notion of human agency in regards to pushing the affairs of Earth is out the window and subordinate to the whim and the wills of dictator for life, the man of steel, Superman. Cynical doesn't make it wrong. Thanks all.